Why are so many people in history called the Great? Chapter 1, Sargon of Akkad. Chronologically, Sargon is the first great person. He lived during the 24th century BCE. He's possibly the first ever emperor in history, but we only learned of his existence in the 19th century, over 4,000 years after his reign. Archaeologists found clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamian ruins, which were translated and described his life. But he's never called the Great. Inscriptions found on artifacts throughout the 9th to 7th centuries BCE do refer to him as a great king. He became Sargon the Great later through historical developments. Chapter 2, Cyrus II of Persia. 1800 years after Sargon's reign, Cyrus II founded the Achaemenid Empire. He also wasn't known as great until later in history. Common translations of the Cyrus cylinder have led to the idea he was called Great King, but this is probably a mistranslation. Cyrus was more likely referred to as strong or mighty. About a century after his life, professional historians became a thing in ancient Greece. Herodotus and Xenophon are the two main players in this context. Histories was written around 430 BCE and Cyropedia around 370 BCE. Neither explicitly refer to Cyrus as the Great, but he is portrayed favorably from the ancient Greek perspective. To them, Cyrus isn't great just because he was a king. He's great because he did great things. The source material they drew from already placed Cyrus on a pedestal. They used Cyrus as a literary device, highlighting how a great leader should act. They made Cyrus ideologically great. He's described as fair, just, and noble, and men were willingly governed by him. But by the 4th century BCE, he's still not Cyrus the Great. Chapter 3, Alexander III of Macedon. When you think of the Great, this is probably who you imagine. By just 30 years old, he had established one of the largest empires in history. Alexander lived in the 4th century BCE. Like Sargon and Cyrus, his title was formalized later in history, but it wasn't first used by a historian. It was used by a Roman playwright. Plautus. 100 years after Alexander's life, Plautus wrote Mostellaria. It's thought to be a Roman adaptation of a lost Greek comedy. It tends to be translated as haunted house or ghost. Alexander isn't a main character in the play. He's vaguely alluded to as Alexandrum Magnum, literally Alexander the Great. It comes from the Greek adjective megas. Referring to him as Alexander the Great implies that this was how he was known by the audience. He's basically famous for being great. But in formal history, he still isn't called Alexander the Great. For another 250 years, historians write about his greatness, just not as its own historical category. Chapter 4, Pompey Magnus. Pompey lived during the 1st century BCE. Unlike Sargon and Cyrus, Pompey actually was called Pompey the Great during his life. It wasn't a title given to him by historians. It was basically his name. Ancient Romans had a 3-part naming system for male elites. Trionomina, it was made up of 3 parts. Praenomen, a first name. Nomen, a clan name. And cognomen, a sort of hereditary name. Sometimes cognomens were just nicknames, or a word to reflect a person's attributes. There are some really interesting examples of cognomens, which highlight how they became a fixed part of a person's identity. Caesar became the title for a Roman emperor, but it was a cognomen that Julius inherited. Its exact meaning has been lost, but it might have referred to an ancestor having been born by caesarean section, or striking eyes, or ironically, a full head of hair. Marcus Tullius Cicero is now entirely known by his cognomen. It means chickpea in Latin. Cicero was probably inherited from an ancestor who had a pea-shaped wart. Despite the mockery, Cicero continued to use it. We even talk about Ciceronian rhetoric now. Brutus typically meant dull or stupid, but like Cicero, Junius kept the name, and it's now synonymous with his character. Pompey was actually responsible for the execution of Brutus's father, but he still joined Pompey in the civil war of 49 to 48 BC against Caesar. Pompey was given the Magnus cognomen by Sulla. According to Plutarch, he embraced the title and encouraged others to use it. probably because he admired Alexander from an early age, even though formally Alexander isn't known as the Great yet in history books. Later in his life, Pompey modeled himself after Alexander. He copied his hairstyle and even the direction of his military campaigns. Giving Pompey the cognomen Magnus might have been a joke. Cognomens were oftentimes used mockingly, but given Pompey's infatuation with Alexander, the cultural connection is quite clear. The interesting thing about Pompey is that he wasn't titled the Great by historians. His cognomen was simply translated this way, and now we remember him on the very same list that Alexander sits. Chapter 5, Real Great. Pompey was assassinated in Egypt in 48 BC. There isn't much in terms of greatness again until about 100 years later. Curtius Rufus writes, Historiae Alexandriae Magni in the 1st century AD. This is where the title becomes explicit. In Rufus's writing, Alexander is no longer just great, he is the Great. This is more than 350 years after his death. You can tell by the name, Histories of Alexander the Great. This was different. He's no longer using Alexander as a literary device. Rufus writes about him as if he's already known as the Great. The phrase is standardized. Around the same time as Rufus's Latin history, Plutarch's biography of Alexander, Bios Alexandrou, is written in ancient Greek. Like Rufus, Plutarch standardizes Alexander the Great, Homegas, based on Mostellaria and the usage of Alexandra Magnum some 250 years before Rufus and Plutarch. We can infer that the wider audiences of their writings were already familiar with Alexander the Great. Now it is concrete in formal history. Chapter 6, Constantine, Great Emperor. Alexander remains the quintessential great for a long time. Rufus and Plutarch's writings are widely circulated for hundreds of years. From the 4th century onwards, Alexander the Great is consolidated as a formulaic identity by Byzantine historians. During this period, a Roman emperor also starts being referred to as the Great, Constantine. He died in 337 AD, and by the 5th century, Constantine Homegas starts to emerge in Greek historiography. His title follows a similar path to Alexander. His greatness is first described but doesn't immediately become fixed. Socrates Scholasticus, not the same titular Socrates who lived 1,000 years prior, refers to Constantine as the Great Emperor. But it isn't rigid. This is repeated in Chronographia and Chronographias, gradually developing as a fixed title, Constantine the Great. Constantine's greatness is tied to his spread of Christianity. Historians during this time look upon him favorably, but for basically 1,000 years, Constantine and Alexander are still the only two formulaic great people in the history books. Chapter 7, Everyone is Great. After Constantine, tracing greatness isn't as chronological. World history isn't just dominated by Roman and Greek writers. Unique cultures begin to emerge. During the High Middle Ages, we see the likes of Charlemagne, Alfred, and Canute become great. Charlemagne was the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. This was very different than the non-Holy Roman Empire. After his death in 814, Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, gradually emerges, but a lot quicker than it did for Alexander. By the end of the 10th century, it was commonplace in Latin historiography. Alfred died in 899. He was a big proponent of Old English and did a lot to preserve it. He commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which used Old English prose to record year-by-year historical annals. This will be a separate video in the future. Ironically, Alfred was never known as Alfred the Great in Old English. It wasn't until after the Norman conquest that the Great started being applied in Latin. This started in 13th century histories, but it wasn't really until the 16th century that it started to catch on. Canute ruled the North Sea Empire of England, Denmark, and Norway until his death in 1035. It's not until roughly 200 years after his death that Latin historians start using the phrase Canutus Magnus. This doesn't develop into a fixed epithet until around the 14th century. Basically, after Alexander and then Constantine, the idea of referring to leaders retrospectively as the Great becomes more common for historians. Another aspect that probably plays a role here is that European naming conventions meant that there was a small pool of names. Charlemagne, Alfred, and Canute were common names, and shared with a long line of earlier historical figures. As recording history became more systematic, applying the Great was helpful for distinguishing them, especially because surnames were much less common and there wasn't a naming system like the Roman Empire's Tria Nomina. Chapter 8. Enlightened Greatness. Things change in the 17th century. There's less of a gradual refining process of the Great being applied. Instead, it's contemporary and political. Peter achieves the Great status very quickly. He became Tsar of Russia in 1682 and died in 1725. He fought wars, annexed lands, and helped to modernize Russia and simplified the Cyrillic alphabet. Peter the Great is actively used during his reign. It's used in official court, state, and diplomatic documents. Due to his westernization of Russia, Enlightenment writers fully standardized the Great. Probably the most prolific Enlightenment writer, Voltaire, happily adopted Peter the Great from its contemporary usage and thoroughly canonized Pierre le Grand in historiography. His work, Histoire de l'Empire de Russie sous Pierre le Grand, achieved an international audience. For many outside of Russia, their first encounter with Peter was literally as the Great. Catherine was known as the Great even more explicitly during her lifetime. She became Empress of Russia 37 years after Peter had been its monarch. This interim period had been a turbulent time in Russian history. Catherine sought to establish continuity and restore the greatness of Peter's reign. The Great is quickly applied to Catherine's name in official state documents. Enlightenment writers are also quick to adopt to moniker. Voltaire actually had direct communication with Catherine during her life and widely disseminates the title. Similarly, Diderot was personally invested in Catherine's reign because she actively promoted Enlightenment writing. By the 1780s, Catherine the Great was standard in European discourse, over a decade before her death. Frederick II of Prussia is similar to his Russian counterparts. He becomes king in 1740, and Frederick der Grosse quickly circulates, firstly in court and state documents. He led during the 7 Years' War between 1756 to 1763, which ultimately preserved Prussia's existence. The wider reference to Frederick the Great was again cemented in Europe by Enlightenment writers. Voltaire wrote to Frederick for nearly 50 years, and Frederick le Grand featured prominently in his writings. For Frederick, Peter, and Catherine, the Great epithet is circulated across their own native language for ideological and political purposes, but it is adopted in French and Latin by Enlightenment thinkers, quickly being translated more widely. Enlightenment writers cement the title in European history and influence its continued usage to this day. Chapter 9. Make everyone great again. Plenty of historical figures are referred to as great by this point. Alexander, Pompey, Constantine, Charlemagne, Alfred, Canute, Peter, Catherine, and Frederick. Enlightenment writers basically standardized the great as a historical category. Earlier rulers who fit the Enlightened perspective of greatness are retrospectively placed here. The Encyclopédie was a collaborative Enlightenment work that systemizes history and standardizes naming conventions. By this point, there are plenty of examples of earlier characters being referred to as the Great, and the Encyclopédie uses these titles as historical fact. There are Greek and Latin examples of Cyrus being referred to as Megas or Magnus. Encyclopédie adopts this, cementing the title in wider historiography. Similarly, Pompey is mentioned, referred to as Pompey le Grand, but this was already fairly concrete, given that it was essentially his name. Alexandre le Grand is also mentioned hundreds of times in the Encyclopédie, but again, he's basically the quintessential great by this point. But we still didn't know that Sargon existed until 100 years after the Encyclopédie. The great framework had already been well established by Enlightenment works when Sargon was discovered. Like Cyrus, he's portrayed as a founder who seems to bring order to society. He fits the great category. Assyriology only emerges as a field of study in the late 19th century. At the time, Sargon's contemporary titles are too culturally specific to fit into modern categories. His previous imperial titles are gradually translated into the Great because of his similarities with the other greats. Sargon the Great is a familiar and recognizable title for a ruler who existed over 4,000 years prior to the Enlightenment and the history produced during its time. Conclusion: history is written by the victors. Modern scholars tend to argue that the great is an oversimplification and reveals far more about the societies and dominant culture of historians rather than those it describes. And there's a lot of truth in that. But the adjective great has been used throughout history to describe important individuals, whether that be in Latin as Magnus, Greek as Megas, or the countless other languages that now have recorded histories. It's been used in place of surnames to differentiate rulers. It's been used politically to legitimize rulers during their reign, but mostly it's cemented retrospectively. If any of these characters didn't fit the current perception of greatness, the title would likely be lost in some capacity. Historically, Sargon is the first great, followed by Cyrus. But the practice is so much more complex than that. Now we have a huge list of great people, not because they fitted into the moral definition of greatness during their time, but because they are, in some way, significant to modern historians. I never intended for this video to be this long and really underestimated how much research was required. This is my first video, so if you found it interesting and would like to see more, I would be grateful if you could subscribe to the channel.